Today we're starting a new study on the tabernacle. So I hope this will be interesting to you. It's fascinating. A lot of times we just know the tabernacle existed, but we don't realize how important it was, not just to the worship of the Israelites, but also in what it taught about the nature of God, the nature of heaven, nature of sin, and the nature of salvation, as well as prophetic um, allusions that it gave to Christ as our Savior. So it's important for us to look at it and see how the Lord was trying to teach by type, 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 um, in the Old Testament. So follow along as I read from Exodus 25, 1 through 9. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to bring me an offering. You are to receive the offering for me from everyone whose heart prompts them to give. These are the offerings you are to receive from them: gold, silver, and bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and fine linen, goat hair, ram skins dyed red, and another type of durable leather, acacia wood, olive oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil and for the fragrant incense, and onyx stones and other gems to be mounted on the ephod and breastplate. Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you." Well, first of all, just as a means of explanation, tabernacle is just a word for tent. It's just another word for tent. So we're talking about a special tent that God had told the Israelites to make for him. Now, again, they were living in tents when this happened. They all had their own tabernacle, if you will, but this is the tabernacle, and that sets it apart. Let's think about the context before we get into actually the study of the tabernacle itself. The context in which the tabernacle was made. Um, when the Israelites were freed from bondage from the Egyptians, well, it was a wonderful day, but it also would have left them a bit disoriented. Just imagine if you wanted to come. Well, for those of us in America or other places, you say, "Oh, I want to go to Disney World." And so you want to go to Disney World, you get excited about it. And then I'll tell you what will happen when you walk into Disney World the first time. It's a little disorienting because you say, "Well, now which way do I go? What do I do first?" And how find I don't know where anything is. I have to find it and so on. So it can be a little disorienting, as exciting, as wonderful as it is. Sometimes that's true if you like people who travel to the UK for the first time or to the United States for the first time. It's wonderful, but it's also very confusing because there's different things, any country actually, that you would go into. So we think about the Israelites. They came out of Egypt. They just come through the Red Sea, and they realized when Pharaoh's army was coming after them, we don't know how to fight. We have no military training. We can't do battle with these Egyptians. Now, fortunately, God delivered them. It wasn't an issue, but nonetheless, it was, a little frightening. And of course, that'll throw you off a bit. We also look at the fact that they had been living in homes that were made of brick of some sort, and now they were living in tents. Well, that's a change that comes, and pretty big change from moving in from solid structures. Like what happens during a storm? You're not as secure, that kind of thing. They were uncertain about the way they were going. Where are we headed? Where are we going? What's next? And it wasn't like they had a nice little route planned out for them, a GPS that was going to tell them to go from here to there. Um, and sometimes, as bad as slavery was, they knew what to expect. They knew they got up, they went to work, they did whatever the tasks they were told to do by the Egyptians. But now all that had changed. They got up. There wasn't a task or a set of duties already laid out for them, and they had gone from slavery to walking by faith. And listen, if you've gone from living without the Lord, all of a sudden you're living with the Lord, it's a little disorienting. You're saying it's disorienting, I should say. You say, well, what do we do about this, and how do we handle this, and so on. So we can understand that there was a period of adjustment that they had, a culture shock, if you will, as they moved into the way that God was leading them. Well, God reassured the Israelites in four primary ways as we think about those. There were the miracles that he performed. And of course, the greatest of the miracles, the most dramatic miracles, were the plagues that he sent on Egypt that ended up in them being freed. Now, that was clearly God interceding in the events of human beings and showing himself in a way that certainly got their attention and in a way that could not be explained away by people just saying, well, that was an accident. And then, of course, there was God's deliverance through the Red Sea. We remember that. And here the sea opened and they passed through, and the Egyptian army was destroyed. So that not only did they get through the sea and get away from that situation, but Pharaoh's army being destroyed meant that Pharaoh could not come back after them at any time. The Egyptian army was destroyed, so they were secure on the other side of the bank of the Red Sea. And then there were other miracles like the water that came out of the rock, the manna, and so on and so forth. So there were these kinds of miracles. And then also there was the assurance of God that came through the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night that led them in the way that they were to go. And so that was reassuring that God's presence was with them. So, but those two things were temporary. Now, to be sure, we do see miracles come back in any number of times in the Bible, but they weren't part of the everyday life of the people. They were unusual. And same thing, we occasionally would see smoke filling the temple. We occasionally see fire like with Elijah, but it was not an everyday thing. So these were temporary things meant for just a short period of time. However, there were two other ways that God made sure that his presence was known among them. The next one was the law. And of course, remember Mount Sinai and Moses going up on Mount Sinai, receiving the law. And in that law, God gave instructions on how to live rather than just guessing and thinking, I think we should do this or I think we should do that. Or with the morality that they had been just enculturated with in Egypt, rather than that morality being what guided them, there was a new morality that God had, a new way of living, a new set of standards. And so God instructed them how to live and how to be in harmony with him. How do I please God? Well, this is what I must do to please God. So the law was a way, an everyday part of their existence. And so we think about that when Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. When we keep the Lord's commandments, we are assured it's not just a matter of doing the things, but that they remind us that we don't live to ourselves, that we live for the Lord, that we are connected to him. So the law was important. And then, of course, the tabernacle that we're going to be studying about. Here was a physical representation of God's presence among the children of Israel, a focus for their worship, a focus for their devotion to the Lord, where they could go and where they could know that they deal with the issue of their sins and any number of other things. So it was, and in the tabernacle, God revealed himself to the Israelites so that they would know more about him. Now, we know that the tabernacle was patterned after heaven. Obviously, heaven is expansive. Heaven can't quite be contained in any kind of earthly definitions, but it gave them an idea of the elements that were in heaven, the things that they would find when they passed from this life to the next, and they lived in the presence of the Lord. Now, what we find, of course, is the tabernacle partnered with the law to promote the instruction and provided the means of acceptable worship to God. Now, again, we look at that. What was acceptable worship? Well, remember, they came from Egypt. And Egypt, even now we see, they had a strange kind of religion where, cats were sacred and snakes were sacred, where they would take the parts of humans and put them with animals. Like the Sphinx is a great example of that, with the head of a man and the body of a lion. It was a weird kind of religion. It wasn't enough that there were all these imaginary gods, and if there weren't all these animals, but they took them and combined them into something new. And so what was that would have been the culture they grew up in. They had seen their whole lives, and now they needed to see a different way that God truly was to be seen among them, and the tabernacle helped them to see this. Also, and very important to us, as we look back at the tabernacle and we see the different parts of it and how things operated, we find they are prophetic of Christ. They're and it's really wonderful as we get into this study. We'll see how the materials that were used and the way they happened, from the linen wall that surrounded the tabernacle to the brazen altar to the to the Ark of the Covenant. All these things were prophetic of Christ, and so it's important for us to know it for that. So we know too, just as an aside, obviously the tabernacle did not last forever. It did for several centuries, but then it was replaced by the temple. But the temple essentially was just taking bricks and mortar instead of the tent material, and everything else was kept the same way with the order of things and so on. Although they did a few more enhancements, but pretty much it was just a permanent structure to replace the tabernacle. So what do we want to know as we go into this? Well, as people, God immediately said that he was going to call some people, sanctify some people, set them apart for himself. First of all, he said that the Israelites were set apart for himself, as we are as believers. We are set apart for the Lord. But also, of course, we have people who had specific roles. We had the family of Aaron, who were the priests. Now, eventually, that broke down, and by the time we get to Jesus, it was a political appointment, and it wasn't related to any tribe of Israel at all. But at the time, the Lord's intention was that this family was set aside for the calling to be priests. And then there were the Levites who did all the work around the tabernacle and prepared things and got things ready, and from time to time did help the priests out, as we find in the book of Ezra and in Nehemiah. We find that. But they were set apart. And then, of course, there was the two gentlemen that God said were to actually take the materials and construct and shape everything. Bezalel and Aholiab. There's a name for you. Nobody names their children that now. Aholiab, because we can't say it, especially if you're angry at your child. You can't get that out in a hurry. Anyway, so these people were set apart. And we need to realize that even today, God sets some people apart for special work for him. Now, unfortunately, I think within the church and even the Salvation Army, we see this thing of saying everybody's the same. In a sense, we're all the same. There's a priesthood of all believers where we all can come to Christ. We don't need somebody else to intercede for us and so on. And yet we need to realize that God does set some people apart. He does call some people to do special work for him. So vocationally, it's not an option of I'll be an officer or a preacher, or I might be a mechanic or whatever. No, if God calls somebody to a specific purpose, then they are best, their life is best lived fulfilling that purpose. Not that they're superior, but they're obligated once God speaks to them. Well, there's a lot that we're going to look at as we go through this study of the tabernacle, but I just want to give these few little bits of background. So we'll start next week in earnest. It might be good for you just to jot down some notes as we go along, because when we talk about, like, what did gold represent? What did silver represent? What did acacia wood represent? They all represented something that speaks about the nature of God. And it's easy to get that confused. So I just suggest maybe if you're one who takes notes, that you'd be ready to do so. Well, I look forward to the study together. So God bless you, and pray that the Lord would show something new about himself to you, not just through this, but through whatever you do in your discipleship with him. God bless you.